Wyoming Territory, 1878. Dust swirled across the open range of Sweetwater Valley, where the Triple S Ranch stood as a testament to one man's stubborn will against the untamed frontier. Jackson Sutherland had built his cattle empire through grit and determination, convinced that the vast emptiness of the Wyoming plains mirrored the necessary condition of his heart. At 26, he'd already decided that ranching and love were incompatible pursuits in this harsh land. The early spring sunrise painted the weathered ranch house in gold as Jackson stood on the porch, surveying his domain with weary eyes. 5,000 acres, 300 head of cattle, and a bunkhouse full of hungry, overworked men who were growing increasingly vocal about the poor quality of meals since their cook had abandoned them for the California gold fields. "Can't keep good hands without good food," his foreman had warned yesterday. "Men are talking about the Circle B hiring." Jackson ran his hand through his sandy brown hair, a habit that betrayed his frustration. His tall, lean frame carried the strength of a man who worked alongside his hands, but lately, the burden of running the ranch alone weighed heavier than any physical labor. The Triple S was everything to him, the culmination of a promise he'd made at his father's grave 5 years ago. He couldn't lose it now because of something as trivial as meals. "The frontier demands sacrifice," he muttered to himself, repeating the mantra that had sustained him through blizzards, drought, and rustlers. "A man who divides his attention fails at everything." It was the lesson his father had taught him before a Cheyenne arrow took his life during the last of the Indian conflicts. Jackson had learned it well, purging all distractions from his life to focus solely on the ranch. He had convinced himself that the hollow feeling in his chest at night was simply exhaustion, not loneliness. That afternoon, the distant rumble of wagon wheels broke the prairie silence. Jackson squinted against the sun to see a modest buckboard approaching, driven by Emmett Gardner from town. Beside him sat a young woman in a simple blue dress, her honey-blonde hair partially visible beneath a practical bonnet. "Mr. Sutherland," Gardner called as he pulled the wagon to a stop. "Brought an answer to your advertisement." Jackson approached cautiously. "Advertisement?" "For a cook," Gardner clarified with a chuckle. "This here is my niece, Miss Olivia Gilbert. 20 years old, finest cook in 3 counties back in Missouri." The young woman met Jackson's gaze directly, something uncommon among frontier women. Her eyes were a striking clear blue, her complexion fair but with a healthy glow that spoke of work rather than idleness. There was a quiet determination in her face that gave Jackson pause. "Mr. Sutherland," she said, her voice surprisingly confident, "I understand you need someone to feed your men." Jackson frowned. The advertisement was for a cook. "I expected." "A man," she finished his sentence with the slightest curve of her lips. "My father ran a boarding house in St. Joseph. I've been cooking for hungry men since I was 12 years old." "This isn't Santa Joseph," Jackson replied firmly. "This is rough country with rougher men, no place for a young woman alone." Olivia's expression didn't waver. "I'm not asking to wrangle cattle, Mr. Sutherland, just to cook in your kitchen. Unless you believe your men are too uncivilized to respect boundaries." The challenge in her tone caught him off guard. Most of the women he encountered in Wyoming were either hardened by frontier life or too timid to speak their minds. "My ranch hands are decent men," he found himself defending them, "but this is the frontier. Life here is unforgiving." "So is hunger," she replied simply. "And from what Uncle Emmett tells me, your men are close to mutiny over the current state of their meals." Gardner cleared his throat awkwardly. "Olivia's just arrived on the stage last week. Her parents passed in the influenza outbreak back east. She needs work and you need a cook." Jackson studied the young woman more carefully. Beneath her composed exterior, he recognized something familiar, the look of someone who had lost everything but refused to be broken by it. It was the same expression he saw in his own mirror each morning. 2 weeks, he finally said. "A trial period, you'll stay in the small room off the kitchen. First sign of trouble, you return to town." "Fair enough," Olivia nodded, already gathering her modest belongings. "I'll need to see your provisions before planning tomorrow's meals." And just like that, Jackson Sutherland found himself helping a young woman with honey-blonde hair down from a wagon, wondering what madness had possessed him to allow this disruption to his carefully ordered ranch. That evening, the bunkhouse erupted in cheers when Jackson announced the new arrangement. The men's enthusiasm only deepened his concern that he'd made a terrible mistake. As he walked back to the main house, he reinforced his conviction. Olivia Gilbert was just a cook, a temporary solution to maintain the workforce he needed, nothing more. The ranch comes first, he reminded himself. Always has, always will. 2 days later, Jackson stood frozen in the doorway of his own dining room, watching as his ranch hands filed in for breakfast, their usual morning grumbles replaced by anticipation. The long table that had been merely functional for years now bore plates of golden biscuits, strips of bacon, and a massive skillet of scrambled eggs flecked with peppers and onions. The scent alone seemed to transform the weathered room. "Good morning, Mr. Sutherland," Olivia greeted him, setting down a pot of coffee. Her hair was neatly braided, her sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms dusted with flour. "I hope you don't mind. I thought it might improve morale if the men had a proper place to eat, rather than balancing plates on their knees." Before he could respond, his foreman, Jim Kelly, clapped him on the shoulder. "Boss, if you send this angel back to town, we're all following her," he declared, only half joking. Jackson watched, bewildered, as his normally rowdy crew behaved with surprising decorum, removing hats and using please and thank you as Olivia served them. One by one, their expressions changed at the first bite, stunned appreciation followed by the focused silence of men who'd forgotten what real food tasted like. When Jackson finally took his seat and tasted the simple fare, he understood their reaction. The biscuits were light and buttery, the eggs perfectly seasoned. It wasn't fancy cooking, but it carried something he hadn't experienced in years: care. "Just doing what you hired me for," Olivia said when he reluctantly complimented her after the men had departed for their chores, leaving the dining room startlingly clean. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" Jackson asked, lingering over his coffee. Something flickered across her face, sadness perhaps, before she composed herself. "My mother taught me the basics, the rest came from necessity." Father's boarding house catered to riverboat men and traders. They'd seen enough of the world to know good food from bad. "And what brought you to Wyoming?" he pressed, surprising himself with his curiosity. Olivia's hands stilled on the towel she was holding. "The same thing that brings most people to the frontier, Mr. Sutherland, a fresh start." She turned away, effectively ending the conversation. "I'll need to begin preparations for the midday meal." Watching her efficient movements in his kitchen, Jackson felt an unfamiliar discomfort. "Twister weather," Kelly warned as they raced to secure what they could around the ranch yard. Jackson was helping the last of his men shelter the horses when he realized he hadn't seen Olivia. Alarm shot through him as he spotted her small figure racing across the open yard toward the clothesline, where freshly laundered sheets flapped violently in the wind. "Leave them," he shouted over the rising gale, but his words were lost in the thunderous sky. Without thinking, he sprinted toward her, reaching her just as the first massive hailstones began to fall. They were the size of walnuts, striking with enough force to bruise. Instinctively, he pulled her beneath him, sheltering her with his body as they stumbled toward the root cellar, the nearest safe structure. Inside the earthen darkness, the storm's fury became a distant roar. Jackson became acutely aware of Olivia trembling against him, her breath coming in quick gasps. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, hands checking her shoulders, arms. "No," she whispered, then laughed shakily. "Though my pride might be, I shouldn't have risked it for linens." "Damned foolish," he agreed, relief making his tone harsher than intended. A flash of lightning illuminated her face, so close to his own. "You came after me," she said quietly. "That was equally foolish by your own standards." Jackson had no ready answer. The realization that he'd acted without calculation, that his first thought had been for her safety rather than what her loss would mean for the ranch, unsettled him deeply. "I'm responsible for everyone on this ranch," he finally said, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. Olivia said nothing, but even in the dim light he could see she didn't believe him. Worse, he wasn't sure he believed himself anymore. The storm passed, leaving behind a chastened landscape of flattened grass and scattered debris. Thankfully, the buildings had survived with minimal damage, and no animals were lost. As life returned to its rhythm, Jackson found himself increasingly distracted by Olivia's presence. He noticed things he had trained himself to ignore for years: the way morning light transformed his plain dining room, the comfort of returning to a house that smelled of bread rather than dust, the sound of humming from the kitchen as he worked on accounts in the evening. More disturbing was how the men had begun bringing her small tokens from their rides: wildflowers, an interesting rock, once even a turtle that now resided in a makeshift pen near the garden she'd started. They treated her with a blend of respect and protective affection that made Jackson uncomfortably aware of his own growing feelings. 2 weeks turned into a month without discussion of her leaving. Jackson told himself it was because the men worked harder with good food in their bellies. He ignored the hollowness he felt on the rare occasions when she rode into town with Gardner for supplies. Until the incident at Miller's general store changed everything. Olivia had gone to town for provisions, taking the light wagon and promising to return by mid-afternoon. When dusk approached with no sign of her, Jackson's unease grew into genuine worry. He was saddling his horse when one of the younger hands, Todd, came galloping into the yard. "Boss, there's trouble at Miller's." Miss Gilbert, the boy's face was flushed with exertion and concern. Jackson didn't wait to hear more. He rode hard toward Sweetwater, his mind conjuring increasingly dire scenarios. The town was unusually animated when he arrived. Clusters of people gathered outside the general store. He spotted the Triple S wagon, still loaded with supplies, but no sign of Olivia. Inside Miller's, he found her standing rigidly by the counter, face pale but composed. Across from her stood Victor Harmon, owner of the neighboring Circle B ranch and Jackson's longtime rival for water rights. At 45, Harmon had buried 2 wives and was known for his quick temper and quicker trigger finger. "Sutherland," Harmon acknowledged with a cold smile, "just getting acquainted with your lovely cook here," offering her a position at a more established ranch. The possessive way Harmon's eyes lingered on Olivia made Jackson's blood boil. She met his gaze with evident relief. "Mr. Harmon was just leaving," she said firmly. "Was I?" Harmon's hand moved to rest casually near his holstered pistol. "Seems to me a woman like you is wasted cooking for cowpunchers. I need a wife, not just a cook." The store fell silent. Even in frontier towns, such blatant propositions to respectable women weren't made publicly. The fact that Harmon had done so suggested he'd already been drinking. "Miss Gilbert works for me," Jackson said, his voice dangerously quiet, "and she's under my protection." Harmon's eyes narrowed. "Protection, that what they're calling it now? Word is, she's living in your house, Sutherland." "Didn't figure you for a man who'd keep." He never finished the sentence. Jackson's fist connected with his jaw with enough force to send him sprawling into a display of canned goods. The crash echoed through the stunned store. "Apologize to the lady," Jackson demanded as Harmon struggled to his feet. For a terrible moment, it seemed Harmon would draw his gun. His hand twitched toward the holster before he apparently thought better of it, noting the witnesses. "No need to get riled over a simple misunderstanding," Harmon said, dabbing at his split lip. His eyes, however, promised retribution. "But a man ought to properly claim what's his, Sutherland. Otherwise, others might get ideas." After Harmon stalked out, the storekeeper's wife approached Olivia with concern. "You all right, dear? That man's had his eye on every unmarried woman under 30 since his last wife passed." "I'm fine, Mrs. Miller," Olivia assured her, though her hands trembled slightly. "Mr. Sutherland, I'd like to return to the ranch now, please." The ride back was tense with unspoken words. Jackson could feel Olivia's sideways glances, but he kept his eyes fixed on the trail ahead, his thoughts turbulent. It wasn't until they were alone in the ranch yard unloading supplies that she finally broke the silence. "You shouldn't have hit him," she said quietly. "He insulted you," Jackson replied stiffly. "He insulted both of us," Olivia corrected, "but violence rarely improves such situations." Jackson set down a sack of flour with more force than necessary. "This isn't St. Joseph, Olivia. Out here, a man's reputation and a woman's can mean the difference between life and death." "And what exactly is my reputation now?" she asked, her voice steady but her eyes troubled. "The unmarried woman living in your house, Mr. Harmon wasn't the first to make assumptions. He was simply the first crude enough to speak them aloud. The implication hit Jackson like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on the practical benefits of her presence that he'd overlooked how it might appear to others and what it might cost her. "I never considered," he began. "No," she interrupted gently. "You didn't, because to you I'm just the cook, a solution to a problem but to others." She left the sentence unfinished, gathering her skirts to climb down from the wagon. Jackson automatically offered his hand to help her, and when their fingers connected, he felt something shift between them, an acknowledgement of complications neither had anticipated. "Perhaps," she said, not quite meeting his eyes, "it would be better if I found lodgings in town." The mere suggestion created a hollow feeling in Jackson's chest that he couldn't explain. "The ranch needs you," he said, then corrected himself. "The men need you." "And you, Mr. Sutherland," her blue eyes finally met his, searching. "What do you need?" Jackson had no answer that wouldn't change everything between them. So he said nothing, and after a moment, Olivia nodded as though he had confirmed something she already suspected. She turned toward the house, leaving him alone with the realization that his carefully ordered world had already changed, regardless of what he was willing to admit. That night, unable to sleep, Jackson stood on his porch watching storm clouds gather over the distant mountains. The confrontation with Harmon had forced him to acknowledge what he'd been avoiding. Olivia Gilbert had become essential to the Triple S in ways that extended far beyond meals. The thought of her leaving created a panic he hadn't felt since watching his father die. "The ranch comes first," he whispered his mantra into the night wind, but the words rang hollow. The next morning brought more than just dawn. A writer from town delivered a sealed letter addressed to Olivia. Jackson watched her face pale as she read it in the kitchen doorway. "Bad news?" he asked, trying to sound casual. She hesitated, then handed him the letter. It was from Emmett Gardner, warning that Victor Harmon had been making inquiries about Olivia's background in Missouri and spreading rumors about her character in town. "He's a dangerous enemy to make," she said softly. "Harmon's headed out for this ranch since my father refused to sell to him years ago," Jackson replied, anger rising. "Now he's using you to get to me." "Or perhaps he simply wants what you don't," Olivia suggested, her voice carefully neutral. "A wife." The word hung between them, charged with unspoken possibilities. Jackson's throat tightened. "Is that what you want, to be Harmon's third wife, buried alongside the others within a few years?" The question came out harsher than intended, betraying emotions he wasn't ready to examine. "Of course not," Olivia's eyes flashed. "But this situation cannot continue as it is. People are talking. Your reputation may survive it, but mine won't." The unfairness of frontier society's double standards wasn't lost on Jackson. A bachelor rancher could hire whoever he pleased without censure. A young, unmarried woman had no such luxury. "What would you have me do?" he asked, genuinely uncertain. "I don't know," she admitted, turning away to hide the brightness in her eyes, "but something must change." Change came sooner than either expected. 3 days later, Jackson and his men were moving cattle to higher summer pastures when one of the hands spotted smoke rising from the direction of the ranch house. Jackson's heart seized as he urged his horse into a gallop, outdistancing his men. The scene that greeted him would haunt his nightmares for years. The barn was fully engulfed in flames, and figures he recognized as Harmon's men were circling the main house. Through the chaos, he spotted Olivia on the porch, a rifle in her hands, keeping the men at bay. Jackson's revolver cleared its holster as he charged into the yard, firing warning shots that scattered Harmon's men momentarily. He reached Olivia's side just as his own ranch hands arrived, evening the odds. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, eyes scanning her for injuries. "No," she replied, her voice remarkably steady despite her pale face. "They came for the cattle but found only me. When I wouldn't tell them where you'd moved the herd, they fired the barn." Harmon himself emerged from behind the burning structure, his expression a mixture of rage and calculation. "Unfortunate accident, Sutherland," he called. "Cigarette must have caught the hay. We were just passing by when we noticed." 6 armed men just passing by my property." Jackson's voice was deadly quiet as he positioned himself in front of Olivia. "That's the last lie you'll tell on my land, Harmon." The standoff might have ended in bloodshed if not for the timely arrival of the territorial marshal and his deputies, alerted by the smoke visible for miles. With witnesses on both sides offering contradicting accounts, the marshal could only warn both parties to keep their distance from each other. As Harmon and his men rode off, the marshal pulled Jackson aside. "This feud's escalating, Sutherland. Next time someone's likely to end up dead." "He attacked my home," Jackson growled, "my people." The marshal's weathered face remained impassive. "And how many people is that exactly?" "Because from what I hear in town, you've got a young woman living here under ambiguous circumstances. Makes a man wonder what else is going on at the Triple S." The implications stung, especially coming from a man Jackson had considered an ally. Before he could respond, Olivia approached, her composure restored despite the smoke-stained dress and disheveled hair. "Marshal Peterson," she addressed him directly, "I can assure you that Mr. Sutherland has been nothing but a proper employer and gentleman. If there are rumors suggesting otherwise, they come from those who would benefit from damaging the reputation of this ranch and its owner." The marshal studied her for a long moment. "Be that as it may, Miss Gilbert, appearances matter out here, for your sake as much as his." With a tip of his hat, he rejoined his deputies. In the aftermath, as they surveyed the smoldering remains of the barn, Jackson found himself watching Olivia directing the men in salvaging what they could. Her quiet strength in crisis had revealed something he couldn't ignore. She belonged here, not just as his cook, but as an essential part of what made the Triple S feel like home for the first time since his father's death. The realization terrified him. His belief that the frontier demanded solitude had protected him from the pain of loss for so long. Caring for Olivia meant risking everything he'd built. That night, with the men camped in the yard to guard against further attacks, Jackson found Olivia in the kitchen, methodically kneading bread dough with more force than necessary. "You should be resting," he said from the doorway. "I find work calming," she replied without looking up, "and the men will need feeding come morning, especially after today." "Always thinking of others," he observed, stepping closer. "Why did you stay? When Harmon's men came, you could have hidden, run for town." Her hand stilled. "This is my home too," she said simply. "At least it has felt that way." The admission hung between them, fragile and profound. Jackson moved to stand beside her at the table, close enough to catch the faint scent of lavender that somehow clung to her despite the day's chaos. "It is your home," he confirmed, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "If you want it to be." Olivia finally looked up, flour dusting her cheek and determination in her eyes. "As what, Jackson? Your cook, your housekeeper, the woman of ambiguous circumstances who damages your standing with men like Marshal Peterson." It was the first time she had used his given name, and it affected him more deeply than he would have thought possible. "As whatever you want to be," he answered honestly. "I just know that when I saw smoke today, it wasn't the barn I feared losing." Something in his expression must have conveyed what he couldn't yet put into words, because Olivia's eyes softened. She reached up to touch his face, her flour-dusted fingers gentle against his cheek. "I feared losing you too," she whispered, "when I thought you might ride into a trap." The barriers Jackson had maintained for years crumbled in that moment. He leaned forward hesitantly at first, giving her time to pull away. Instead, she met him halfway, her lips soft against his in a kiss that felt like coming home after a long journey. When they finally parted, Jackson rested his forehead against hers. "I've been a fool," he admitted, "thinking that caring for someone was a weakness out here when it's the only thing that makes any of this worthwhile." "We've both been hiding," Olivia replied. "Me from my past, you from your future." She pulled back slightly to meet his eyes. "But I can't stay as I am, Jackson, not anymore, not after today." I knew she was right. The attack had changed everything, bringing their undefined relationship into sharp focus. Harmon wouldn't stop, and the frontier society around them demanded clear boundaries. "Then marry me," he said, the words emerging with surprising ease. "Not because of Harmon or what people say, but because I can't imagine this ranch or my life without you in it." Olivia's eyes widened. "Jackson, you don't have to." "I want to," he interrupted, taking her flour-covered hands in his. "I love you, Olivia Gilbert. I think I have since you stood in my dining room and accused me of cultivating discomfort." A smile blossomed across her face, radiant even through the exhaustion of the day. "I love you too," she said, "though I had given up hope that you would ever admit your failings." "I'm a slow learner," he acknowledged with a rueful smile, "but I'm hoping you'll have patience with me." "A lifetime's worth," she promised, sealing the words with another kiss. 2 weeks later, the residents of Sweetwater gathered to witness the marriage of Jackson Sutherland to Olivia Gilbert in the town's small church. The Triple S hands, cleaned up and uncomfortably formal in their Sunday best, filled several pews, their pride in their cook marrying their boss evident in every grinning face. Emmett Gardner gave away his niece, who wore a simple white dress adorned with lace she'd salvaged from her mother's wedding gown. As she walked toward Jackson, her honey-blonde hair crowned with wildflowers from the prairie, he felt a certainty he'd never experienced before, that some things were worth any risk. The ceremony was brief, frontier practical, but the celebration afterward lasted well into the night. The Triple S men had constructed a new barn in record time, and it served as the venue for the wedding feast, with trestle tables groaning under the weight of food prepared by the women of Sweetwater, all eager to show their support after Harmon's attack. Victor Harmon himself was conspicuously absent, having departed for Denver on business, shortly after Marshal Peterson began investigating the barn burning more thoroughly. The reprieve was temporary, Jackson knew, but it allowed the day to unfold without tension. As the evening progressed, Jackson found himself standing at the barn door with his new wife, watching their community celebrate around them. "Having regrets?" Olivia asked, a teasing lilt to her voice. "Only that I wasted so much time convinced I had to choose between the ranch and happiness," he replied, drawing her closer. "When you were the missing piece all along." Over her shoulder, he could see the Triple S main house, no longer just a place to sleep between work, but a home with curtains in the windows and flowers on the table. Beyond it stretched the ranch lands that had once been his only purpose, now transformed into a legacy worth building. "What are you thinking?" Olivia asked, following his gaze. "That the frontier isn't about isolation after all," Jackson answered. "It's about creating something that lasts, something bigger than yourself." He turned to face her fully. "And I couldn't have done that alone." "No one should have to," she agreed softly. "That's why we find each other, even out here, perhaps especially out here." 6 months later, as winter settled over the Triple S, Jackson sat at his dining table reviewing the ranch accounts with growing satisfaction. The summer and fall had brought prosperity. The cattle sale in Cheyenne had exceeded expectations, and the new breeding stock promised even better herds in coming years. More importantly, the ranch house had truly become a home. Olivia's touch was everywhere, from the practical improvements to the small luxuries that had once seemed unnecessary but now felt essential. The ranch hands, fiercely loyal to the woman who had started as their cook and become their champion, had built her a proper kitchen garden and even constructed a small schoolhouse on the property, anticipating the children they all assumed would soon follow. Victor Harmon had returned from Denver chastened by legal troubles and the territorial governor's interest in the Triple S attack. While the threat hadn't disappeared entirely, it had receded enough for the newlyweds to focus on their future rather than watching the horizon for trouble. Olivia entered the room carrying a pot of coffee and a plate of her famous apple cake, still warm from the oven. Her presence never failed to make Jackson's heart race, even after months of marriage. "You're working too hard," she chided gently, setting down the refreshments. "The accounts will still be there tomorrow." "Just making sure everything's in order," he replied, pulling her down to sit beside him. "I want to make sure the Triple S is secure for the future, for us." She smiled, a hint of mystery in her expression. "About that future," she began, taking his hand and placing it gently against her still flat stomach. "It may be arriving sooner than we planned." Jackson stared at her in wonder as comprehension dawned. "You're certain?" "As certain as one can be," she confirmed, her eyes bright with emotion. "Come spring, there will be another Sutherland at the Triple S." Joy, profound and overwhelming, surged through Jackson as he pulled his wife into his arms. The frontier that had once seemed so cold and demanding had given him not just survival, but a family, the one thing he'd convinced himself he could never have. Outside, snow began to fall, blanketing the ranch in pristine white. Inside, wrapped in each other's arms, Jackson and Olivia Sutherland planned for a future neither had dared to imagine before fate and courage had brought them together. "I came to cook for your cowboys," Olivia murmured against his shoulder. "I never expected to find a home, a family. And I never expected that hiring a cook would change everything I believed about life on the frontier," Jackson replied, holding her as though she were the most precious thing in the world, because to him she was. "Best decision I ever made." As they stood together at the window, watching snow transform their land into a glistening wonderland, Jackson finally understood the truth his father had never managed to teach him. The frontier wasn't something to be conquered alone. It was a place where love, against all odds, could not only survive but flourish if you were brave enough to let it in.